So for this tutorial, I'm going to take you through how to make your own reversible bucket hat. So this hat can be worn either on the plain side or on the pattern side. So yeah, let's get started and make our very own bucket hat. Okay, so what do we need to create our bucket hat? First off, we need one of the circular pieces. That's going to be the top of the hat. And then you're going to need 2 pieces for the side band of the hat. And then you're also going to need 2 pieces for the brim of the hat. So I've cut out a whole set here in a patterned linen, and I've actually interfaced this set because the felt the linen was going to be a little bit too floppy for the look that I wanted. Traditionally, a bucket hat would be made out of denim or canvas or cotton twill, quite a structured fabric. You can make it out of anything. You could use a couple of fat quarters, but what you do need to make sure is that you've got a little bit of structure, at least in the brim of the hat. So I've decided that I'm going to interface this set of fabric, and then I've cut out exactly the same in the same fabric, but I'm going to use the reverse side so that I've got a plain side and a pattern side. And I just felt that 2 layers of this linen was going to be just a bit too floppy. So that's 2 pieces for the band of the hat. That's the bit that's going to go around the head, piece for the top of the head, and then 2 pieces for the brim. And then the very first thing that we're going to do is take our band pieces and our brim pieces, lay them right side together, and then we're going to stitch down the short edges, and we're going to use a centimetre seam allowance because that's kind of what I added onto the pattern that I took off of a hat that we had at home. Yeah, centimetre seam allowance joining the short edges. So I'll be doing that on the outside pieces and on the lining pieces. Okay, I'll take that to the sewing machine and then I'll bring it back. Okay, so that was quite straightforward. I've joined all of my short edges together and I've now pressed open my seam allowances. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to join the 2 brim pieces together. So I'm going to take one piece and I'm going to match it to the other piece. So first things first, just match up your seams. So I'm going to pop a pin in there, just hold that in place. And then I'm going to go around to the other side and do exactly the same. And we're going to match up our seams on the inside edge, which is the smallest edge, and then we're going to do exactly the same on the outside edge, and then we're going to sew the brims together around the outside edge. There are lots of different ways to construct bucket hats, but I quite like this technique because it means that you can do your curve, the outside edge, really nice and neatly. Whereas some people make an inside and an outside and then they slip the 2 together and turn it through and have an opening in the outside brim edge. But I think that if you hand sew a curve, that's quite tricky if you're not brilliant at hand sewing. So I'm going to pin all the way around and then I'm going to join them on the outside edge, this bigger edge. And again, I'm going to be using a 1 centimetre seam allowance. If when you've pinned you've got any bagging going on, probably just means that one of your seam allowances when you were joining the short edges together a moment ago didn't quite work out, isn't as exact, in which case all you need to do is just go back to the machine and either let one of the seams out a bit or take one of the seams in a bit. But that's all that it will be, and don't worry too much about that because it's the outside edge of the brim and there aren't going to be too many more ramifications. Making sure that our seam allowances are correct is going to help us make sure that everything slots together from the inside edge of the brim onwards. So all neatly pinned, it's sitting together quite nice and flat. So I'm going to stitch that together on the outside edge with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. So when I'm sewing a curve like this, the best thing I can say to you is just to go slow and steady. And what you really need to reference is the edge of your fabric with your seam allowance. And on a curve like we've got on this bucket hat brim, at any point in time, I'm probably going to have between 1 centimetre and 2 centimetres of my brim sitting on that seam allowance at any one time, because the curve is going to mean that it's not always going to be lying flat. So I always start around a seam area, and I'm just going to do a few stitches. And do my reversing. And then I'm just going to really carefully, I'm just always keeping my eye and getting the next bit of the curve to fall onto the seam allowance. Okay, so it's all joined together now around the outside edge. I've just had a quick look at the stitch line I've created, and I'm quite happy that that will be a nice brim edge. So we're going to be turning it through in a moment, so I need to now clip my edge so that I can create the space for turning it through. So because this is currently got to get this right, it's an outie curve is how I would explain it. So a concave curve. When I turn it through, it's going to become an innie curve or a convex curve. And so I need to take away the bulk. So that means that when I'm clipping this, I'm actually going to clip out little triangles. So you need a really sharp pair of scissors, and you're actually going to clip out little triangles, because when you turn it through, they're going to hopefully meet up, but you're looking to reduce the bulk. So you're not looking for the fabric to have to spread apart, you're looking to reduce the bulk. And I'm going to do one of those about every couple of centimetres or every inch, depending on whether you're a metric or an imperial girl. And it's just a little bit tougher for this because I've put interfacing and I've got 2 layers of linen as well. So just make sure you've got a nice pair of scissors. You're not looking to clip all the way up to your stitching. Just stop a bit short, a millimetre or 2 short, but just clip out a little triangle. And this is going to reduce bulk in your brim. So definitely do it, and don't make the gaps between the notches too big. Otherwise, again, that can affect how your brim is going to lay flat or not. So I'm just going to work around the brim, just taking out these little triangles. And then I'll come back and show you what's next. Okay, so the brim of my hat is all notched, one last pin to take out. So what we're going to be doing next is we're going to be turning this through on itself. So just going to bring it round, and then that edge is going to get folded down. So again, what we're going to do now is we're going to carefully go around the edge of the hat, and I'm going to be rolling that seam between my thumbs and my fingers just to make sure that the very edge of the seam is going to sit at the edge of the brim of the hat. So we're going to go round and just gently push, rolling backwards and forwards until the brim is sitting nicely on the edge. That seam is sitting nicely on the edge of the brim. So anywhere where you've got extra bulk because of seams, just make sure you just give a little bit of extra care and attention so it's sitting exactly as you want it to sit, because in a moment we are going to top stitch around the edge of the brim, and then it's entirely up to you. Bucket hats could either have just one line of top stitching going around the edge of the brim, or they also quite often have multiple lines of stitching going around the brim just to kind of strengthen and bring the layers of the fabric together. And that's what I'm going to do. And we can use the quilting bar for that, which we used in one of the other tutorials for the cutlery roll. If you haven't got one, don't worry, but a quilting bar will definitely be helpful if you have. And the nice thing about these lines of stitching is that if you were to buy a hat, they would probably be evenly-ish spaced, but we always assume that things are far more perfect than they are. And if you actually look at shop bought things, you sometimes realise that, oh, it sort of looks like it's evenly spaced, but it isn't. And so we strive for levels of perfection in our own work that sometimes we don't even ask for from something that we purchase. So I can show you with a quilting bar how to get perfectly even parallel lines of stitching, but if you don't have one and you don't fancy sitting there and marking it all out, then just do it by eye and it will be absolutely fine. If you did it in a contrasting thread, it might show up more, but if you're going to do it in a matching thread, then it really isn't going to show much at all. So this is that chance to just have a look at the rim of your brim, that's a tongue twister, and just check you're happy with the curve and that all of the edges have come out as they should. And then we're going to do a line of top stitching around the edge of the brim. And I'll take you over to the machine and show you how I'm going to line up for that, and also how I'm going to line up for the quilting bar as well. Okay, so first up we're going to do our top stitching. So I've brought my rim over to the brim over to the sewing machine, and I've lined up the edge of the presser foot with the edge of my brim. My needle at the moment is coming down probably about 1/4 of an inch in from the edge of the hat. I'd like that to be a bit less, so I'm just going to move my needle over to the right as far as it will go, and then I'm coming down a lot closer to the brim, or the edge of the brim. So I'm now just going to stitch around the brim once with that position. So this is my quilting bar, and it's called a quilting bar because it's used by quilters to create parallel lines of stitching on their quilts. You may or may not have one as standard with your machine. Sometimes you get one if you purchase a walking foot, which is something like this, because a walking foot is used by quilters. But if you have got one, it's going to be really helpful for this project. And I'm just going to insert this part of the quilting bar into the back of my presser foot, into the shank back of my presser foot up there. And then the way the quilting bar works is that you can decide how far apart your lines of stitching are. So if I just insert the brim of my hat under here, I've got a colour matching thread, so you're going to have to trust me on this one. But what I can do is line up the quilting bar so that it is on top of the line of thread, and then work out how far I want my next line of stitching to be. And the distance between my needle and the quilting bar is then going to be regular all the way around the brim of the hat, because the quilting bar is going to be on the line of stitching that I sewed before, and then my needle is going to be tracking that. So I will get parallel lines of stitching on my hat. As I say, if you don't have one of these, you could either attempt to mark it by doing some fabric marking pens, or you could just decide that you're just going to do a kind of ever decreasing circle and just keep going round until you get basically to the inside, or just do an edge of stitching on the top. But I'm using quite a colour matching thread, so you're probably not going to see these lines of stitching. It's more about just creating a bit of structure to the rim and brim of the bucket hat. So I've got about 1 centimetre distance there at the moment, so I'm just going to move it because I want to just get my threads exactly where they should be so they're not in the way. And then the quilting bar sits quite snugly in its hole, so it shouldn't move around too much. And I'm just going to put my needle back into the centre, and I'm just going to move it until it's about there. So that's probably about 1 centimetre distance in the lines. And I'm now just going to stitch around the brim of my hat, keeping one point of your quilting bar on your stitch line at all times. So this is quite a long bar, so I'm just going to make sure that I track that quite carefully round so that I'm not too far from the edge. Of course you could, until you run out of them, use your seam allowance guides as well, so whichever you feel is most useful, but there will become a point further in the brim of the hat where you will have covered up all of your seam allowance guides. Okay, I'm just going to go round and stitch a few lines of stitching around the brim of this hat, and then I'll show you what's next. What we mustn't do, actually, but just catch you, is go too close to the inside, because we've got to allow 1 centimetre seam allowance for joining on the band of the hat, and you want a little bit of give. So I'm actually going to do probably about 3 lines of stitching and stop, and then I can always go back at the end and just do the last line or 2 lines of stitching. So I'm just going to do 3 lines of stitching for the moment, just to allow myself enough room to play with for attaching the bands. Okay, So my brim of my hat is prepared, and I'm just now going to pop that to one side. The next stage of this project is to fit the band that goes around the hat to the circle. So the very first thing we need to do is fold our circle in half, like this, and just mark those points so that we don't lose track of them. So whenever you're fitting something to another shape, it's really good to mark lots of match points. And so then I'm going to bring those pins back together, and then I'm going to also mark these points. So I'll eventually have quarter points marked on the top of the hat, which I can match to. So that's those marked. On here, on the band, we've already got some of them matched because we've got 2 seams. So what I'm going to do is bring those 2 seams together and just pinch the centre on those 2 pieces. And so then if I put a pin in there, I've got quarter points matched on here as well. So now we're going to be fitting that into here. To make it slightly easier for ourselves, we can clip back this so that it smooths out a bit. In a similar way to the fact that we clipped out the brim, we can clip out this and make it lie flat, and it's going to make it slightly easier to match to this. So what you can do is either draw a line on just inside the edge of the brim of the hat, and with a fabric marker pen, or this is a trick that I use quite a bit when I'm hemming things, is you can use your sewing machine to do a line of stitching. So if I was hemming the bottom of a skirt, say down here, and I needed to turn all the hem up by 1 centimetre, you could stitch a line at just inside of 1 centimetre, so at 0.9 of a centimetre, and then that would be your fold line. And then you've got a line marked in, and it's really easy to put that line in evenly all the way around by using the seam allowance markers on your needle plate. So we're using 1 centimetre seam allowance, so I'm just going to use the same principle at the top here. I'm going to stitch a line that's probably about 0.8 to 0.9 millimetres in from the edge. So I'll just measure that out using my needle, and then I can clip down to that line knowing that my seam line is going to be a bit beyond it. If you can't work that out on your machine, perhaps just use a 0.5 centimetre measurement, maybe just use the edge of the presser foot, just something that's less than 1 centimetre but will allow you to clip back the edge of the fabric. So I'll go and do that on the sewing machine, and then I'll come back and show you exactly what I mean. So here we go, I've now got this stitch line, and I created that by lining the edge, the top edge of my brim, of my band rather, with the centimetre seam allowance on my sewing machine, and then I moved my needle from the centre 1 step to the right, so I knew it was going to be less than 1 centimetre. So I've now got this line of stitching all the way around my hat. And what I can do now is I can just use my scissors to clip down to that, and then I will be able to expand my fabric to help fit the top of my hat. So I'm just going to go round. Notice I'm just doing snips. I'm not looking to take anything out because this fabric's going to expand, and I'm probably putting a snip in about every centimetre. And the snip is not going any further than that line of stitching, and this is just going to make it slightly easier for me to fit the band, the brim and the band, not the brim, the top of the hat and the band together. There's too many B words. Okay, so you can see now that that will fan out. Oh, there's a bit there that I haven't done. See now that that will fan out to meet this. So first thing to do is to match your pins. So those 2 pins matched, take that pin out, put it through both layers and take the inside pin out. Find the opposite side, oops, match those 2 pins together. So line your pins up, hold it with your thumb, take 1 pin out, go through both layers, and then take that pin out. And then you can match up the other pins with your side seams. Match it up, take the pin out from one side and slide it through from the other side, like so. And then the other side. So this will be our last quarter point. Match the pin up with the brim, take the pin out, like so. So now we've got to ease the quarters into the quarter, and that's a lot easier. So you could have, if you'd wanted, as well as doing the quarter points, you could have done the 1/8 points and put in extra pins on the outside. The more markers you put in to match up, the better, basically. But I'm quite happy that I think I'll be able to get this done. Having marked those, I'm now going to mark or pin from the flat side of the hat, so the top of the hat, and just get everything to match up, because you can see I'm beginning to make these ones split out. And just bring the two edges of fabric so that they are level. There we go, so that's that bit done. And do exactly the same on this bit round here. So bring the edges of your fabric so that they are level. And you can use as many pins as you like when you're doing this sort of job. Sometimes people use like whole packets of pins, you know, when you're setting sleeves or anything else like that. Don't feel that the more pins you have makes you a worse sewer. It's not true at all. And what you're looking to check is on this side that stitch line is going to be sitting flat with no pucks, tucks, gathers, whatever you want to call it, inside it. So I'm just going to go all the way around and do this. And then you've guessed it, once we've done these two pieces together, it's exactly the same principle on the lining fabric as well, or the other fabric you're using. This one's going to be reversible, so to say one's a lining and one's the outside's a bit deceptive, but they're different fabrics. So I'm just looking here, and I've probably got 4 pins, 3 on that one. I've got about 4 pins in each quarter segment of the hat. So I've quartered the hat off, matching up all my markers, and then I've got about 4 pins. I'm going to stitch from this side so that I know that I'm going to cover that line of stitching that I put in to do my clipping, and I can also see any pucks and gathers, because that side isn't going to puck and gather. It's going to be this side that might puck and gather. So I'm going to stitch it from this side, and I'm going to use a centimetre seam allowance, and when I've stitched this one I will be repeating the process for the other fabric that I'm using. Okay. So here we have 2 hats, basically. There's one layer and there's the other layer. So we've stitched those together. We now need to go back to this seam allowance that we've had in here that we just literally snipped into, and we do need to now reduce some of that bulk, because where we push it into itself, there's going to be too much. So I'm now just going to go around there and just do some cuts to take out some of that bulk, a bit like we did on the brim. Every so often you can use some of the snips that you've already used and take some of that bulk away, because once you've done that, you're going to push it through to the right side, and then we're going to be top stitching around the top of the band, keeping the seam allowance trapped underneath as well. So if you're used to understitching in dressmaking, it's a bit similar to that. We're going to be stitching it down so that that seam allowance is stitched to the band, and we've got a line of top stitching going around the top of the side of the hat, which is the band. So I will be top stitching around here. So you can do that on both hats. So trim away some of the seam allowance so you've not got too much bulk in here, and then we're going to top stitch all the way around the top here on both pieces. So remember, we're going to do this on both bits of the hat. Okay, I'll crack on with that, let you crack on with it as well, and then we'll see what the next step is. Okay, so we've got 3 parts now to our hat. We've got the brim and we've got these 2 hat parts. So I'm going to call this my lining for the moment, and I'm going to take my hat lining and I'm going to match it right sides together with my brim. So the very first thing I'm going to do is match up seams. So I'm going to take those seams together and I'm going to match that up. And what I want to be doing is just pinning my lining fabrics together. Because remember, when we stitched the brim, we didn't stitch all the way to the edge. So that's that side. Then take the other side and match seam to seam. Like that. And then I've just snipped some notches in this time so I don't end up with way too many pins. So I've got notches that I've just snipped in, snips, that I'm just going to match up there and on this side as well. And then again, we're just easing everything into place. Oh, that pin's come out. And you can, if you want to, now that we've got everything matched, you can now bring your pins all the way through to this layer, the right side of your brim. So just going to ease in the band to the brim, basically. So exactly the same principles as before. Just keeping lots of pins and holding it all in place. So I'll just do that and then I'll come back. So my brim is all now pinned to my band. So I'm now going to go round and stitch that in place, and I'm just going to use a centimetre seam allowance, as with all other seam allowances on this project, and just make sure that everything's sitting nice and flat so that I don't get any pins and pucks and tucks. Okay, I'll go and do that and then we can come back. Okay, so that's all attached, and what you want to do now is give that a really good press, either with the iron or just with your fingers, and push that seam allowance up. So you're pushing the fabric back on top of the seam allowance, because when that's going to be the lining of my hat, I want the seam allowance to be going up. So at this stage, if you've got lots of threads, you can also give them a bit of a trim off, but this is all going to get hidden inside, so don't worry too much. Okay, this is now the final piece to be attached. I've gone round and done my trick with my machine stitching to mark out just less than 1 centimetre all around the bottom of the band of this piece, and I'm now going to go round folding that on that line of stitching. So you probably can't see that very well because I've used a colour matching thread, but I'm just going to go round now and finger press that line in place all the way around the bottom of the hat, like so. You could of course use the iron, but I'm just going to finger press for the moment because this has got the non-woven interfacing on the other side. Finger pressing is working quite well. So really I'm pressing so that that line of stitching, albeit that it's pretty invisible anyway, is just getting folded over to the inside edge. So I've now got this pressed all the way around. And what I'm going to do now is slide this over the top matching up my side seams. So I'm going to match up there. And pin it there. So as always, I always match the most important points first. And so then I'm going to match up that side seam there. So you're bringing your hat down on top of before, and you're matching up the fold just past the stitch line that you've already got showing. And then I'm going to pin that all the way around so that it's covering up, just covering up that line of stitching that I had before. And this is where you've got a bit of a choice really. I'm going to machine stitch this on with a colour matching thread so you can't really see it, but you could, if you wanted to at this stage, hand stitch around the bottom of this. That would be just as effective. So I'm just matching up the bottom fold over the line of stitching that I can see on my brim from when I just attached the lining piece. I could have done it in a contrasting thread and it might have been a bit easier for you to see, but I actually am anticipating wearing this hat in the garden over the weekend, so I didn't really want to do that. Just pinning it as you go, and if your seam allowances are all nice and even, then it should fit nice and snugly, which this one is, so that's quite satisfying. I've got some threads hanging there, so I'm just going to trim those out of the way. So as I say, some people might assemble the whole of the bucket hat inside and the whole of the bucket hat outside, and then bag them through, join them together and bag them through. But that often requires that you have an opening on the outside rim of your hat, which you've then got to sew shut. And sometimes it can be quite tricky to do that when you've got a curve going on. So the way that I'm showing you now doesn't require that, but does mean at this stage you've just got to line everything up. But that doesn't take long. And we're basically going to put all the pins in. And then when all the pins are in, just check, hold the hat away from ourselves and just check that it all looks okay. Okay, so that, oh, there's a thread there. So that's all looking and feeling quite even and matched. A little bit there where I think it needs to go. I can just see a bit of my stitching. So I'm just going to slide that up inside a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and I'm now going to stitch along this bottom edge. I will be stitching all the way through to the inside, so make sure that your bobbin thread is colour matched with the inside of your hat. Yeah, I'm going to stitch all the way through and attach the last piece on. So the rim, the band is all now attached to the brim of the hat. I've trimmed off my threads. And at this stage, if you wanted to add in some more lines of stitching on your rim, you could, depending on how many you got crammed in on the first go round. I might go in and put one more row of stitching on in a minute just to balance it out. But there you have one finished bucket hat. And the lovely thing about this one is that it is completely reversible. And that little bit of interfacing that I put into just the one layer of it does mean that I've just got the ability to just tweak and play around with that rim if I want to, and lift it up a little bit rather than having it faced right down. So there we have one simple and easy to make bucket hat. I hope you've enjoyed that project. They're really simple to knock up. I'll put the measurements out, but I traced this pattern off of a hat that we had that fitted me. So it's a one size hat, but of course everyone's got a slightly different head. So I will make sure that my measurements are popped down for you to have as well. And yeah, good luck. And if you make a hat, I do like to see a finished project. So please do tag us. And the tag on Facebook and Instagram is @MadeAndMaking. Thanks very much. Bye.